Ma'am, back of the line. This section is for family and honored guests, not walk-ups. You cannot just stand at the front because you got here early. Let's go. All the way back. You are holding up the whole procession." The sergeant had one hand on the old woman's shoulder and the other on her forearm, and he was already walking her backward off the rope before she had said a single word to him. She did not stumble, and she did not argue. She let the shove move her the way a piling lets a wave move past it, giving nothing, taking nothing, and the white wreath in her hands never tipped a single degree. A faded photograph rode tucked under the wreath's ribbon. The corner of it curled soft with handling, and it didn't slip. She let herself be moved to the place he wanted her, 3 ranks back in the roped line, and then she stopped, as if a wall had grown up behind her heels. It was a bright Memorial Day morning on the parade field of a Marine base, and the whole world had come out for the rededication of the wall. The wall itself stood shrouded at the head of the field, a long new slab of black granite under a white covering that lifted and settled in the sea wind. Folding chairs ran in white rows. A Marine band tuned in the shade of a canvas fly. Near the dais, the official party was forming up. Colonels, a sergeant major of the post, and, at the center of it all, 3 general officers in dress blue, their shoulders bright with stars. Behind the rope, 300 people stood in a slow, patient line. Gold Star mothers with programs pressed to their chests, old men in unit caps, wives holding the hands of grandchildren who did not yet understand where they were. The sergeant walked back to his post at the rope, well pleased with himself. His name tape read, "Dunmore." He was 25, and he had the flat certainty of a young man who has been told he is in charge of a thing and has decided that means he is in charge of everyone near it. The old woman settled where he had put her. She wore a plain, solid red blouse, buttoned to the throat against the morning, and her hair was white and combed back neat and regular, not cropped, the way a woman wears it when she has stopped caring whether anyone thinks it is stylish and started caring only whether it is squared away. She stood with a stillness that did not match the crowd around her. Everyone else in the line was moving, checking phones, shifting weight, fanning programs against the heat. The old woman in the red blouse was the one still point on the whole field, and stillness like that is a thing a certain kind of man learns to notice. 40 feet away, in the crisp dress blues of a ceremony detail, a sergeant major noticed it. His name was Barrett Van, and he had been in the Corps 30 years, and had learned to read a crowd the way a farmer reads a sky. Something about the old woman snagged his eye and would not let go. When the band ran a test bar of ruffles and flourishes, her chin lifted 1/4 of an inch, and her weight came up onto the balls of her feet, the reflex of a body that has come to attention 10,000 times, and will do it again at the first 4 notes, without being asked. Van stopped chewing his gum. It was not the kind of stillness that comes from being tired, or from being old, though she was both. Van had watched a great many old people stand in a great many lines, and they leaned, and they shifted, and they looked around for a chair. This woman stood the way a fence post stands. Her feet were set at the width of her shoulders. Her hands were folded on the wreath at the exact height a rifle would ride on a sling. When a gull cut low over the field, and half the crowd flinched at the shadow of it, she did not so much as blink. Van had spent 30 years learning that the people who do not flinch are the people who have already met the thing worth flinching at, and made their peace with it, and come out the far side of it changed. He filed it away. He did not yet have a name to hang on it, but he had a feeling, low in his gut, the kind of feeling that had kept him alive in 2 wars, and the feeling said, "Pay attention to the old woman in the red blouse." Corporal Levi Ashcroft, 21, drifted over to Dunmore and jerked his chin back at the old woman. That the one who tried to cut? "That's the one," Dunmore said. "Grandma front row. Probably thinks it's the early bird special." They both laughed, low and easy, the way young men laugh when they have decided that being unkind together is a kind of friendship. Van's eyes traveled down from the old woman's steady face to her collar, and stopped. There was a ribbon pinned there, small and old and crooked, the enamel gone soft and pale with the decades. Pale blue, a field of white. He had saluted that ribbon exactly twice in 30 years, and both times his hands had gone cold. His hands went cold now. The ceremony went on, assembling itself around them, indifferent and enormous. A young lance corporal moved down the rope, handing out folded programs, and as he passed, he told the line, cheerfully, that the wall honored the soldiers of Khe-San. "Marines," the old woman said. She did not raise her voice, and she did not look up from the wreath. "And a Navy corpsman named Fitch." The lance corporal blinked and moved on. Dunmore, catching the correction, snorted. "Everybody's a historian," he said to Ashcroft. But it was not a historian's correction. A historian would have said, "the Marines of Khe-San." She had said, "and a Navy corpsman named Fitch," the way a woman gives you the name of someone she watched work, someone whose hands she remembered. There was a corpsman named Fitch on the reverse slope of Hill 881 South at first light on a February morning 58 years gone, and he had worked on the wounded she brought down until his own supply ran out, and then he had worked on them with his hands, and she had never forgotten his name, because you do not forget the name of a man who keeps your Marines breathing. Van did not know any of that yet, but he heard the difference between a fact and a memory, and it moved him 3 more steps closer to the rope. But Van had heard it, and he had heard the way she said it, not like a fact learned from a book, but like a name said at a graveside. He drifted closer along the inside of the rope, close enough now to hear her murmuring under her breath as she watched the official party. She was calling the running order of the ceremony before the program announced it, the invocation, then the reading of the names, then the unveiling, then the wreath-laying, then honors. Reading a piece of music she seemed already to know by heart. 10 feet away, Van heard her name, the wreath-laying a full beat before the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone to announce it. She knows the running order cold, he thought. She has stood in this formation before, on the other side of it. Dunmore saw the sergeant major drifting toward his corner of the rope and read it, wrongly, as pressure on him to keep his sector tidy. He came back over to the old woman fast, reasserting himself. "Ma'am, I already told you, the front is closed. Why don't you go sit in the shade over there before it gets to be too much for you?" He said it slowly and much too loudly, leaning down, the way a man speaks to a child or a dog. "Do you understand me? The front is closed." "I hear you fine, Sergeant." The old woman finally lifted her eyes to him, and they were gray and steady and did not drop. "I've heard worse things whispered than you can shout." For a moment, Dunmore did not have anything to say to that. Then Van was there, at his elbow, quiet. "Sergeant, what's the name?" "She won't give a full one, Sergeant Major. Just Margot. No lanyard, no seat assignment. She's a walk-up." Dunmore said, "walk-up," the way another man might say trespasser. Van looked at the old woman. "Margot," he said gently, "the way you would approach something you were not sure you were allowed to touch." "Ma'am, may I ask, that ribbon at your collar, may I see it?" She held his eyes a moment. Then she gave the smallest nod. He bent and looked, and the blood went out of his face, and he straightened up very slowly, and turned and walked fast toward the command tent, pulling his phone from inside his blouse as he went. The crowd had grown, and the cameras had come out. A local news team had a lens up near the dais. Teenagers in the line filmed everything on their phones, for reasons none of them could have explained. and Dunmore, who had tasted being contradicted twice now in front of his corporal, decided to make the old woman into a bit. "Folks, we got a live one," he announced, playing to Ashcroft and a kid filming over the rope. "Grandma front row here thinks the wreath line's a buffet. Back of the queue, sweetheart. Come on." A few people laughed, because a few people always laugh. The old woman did not react. She stood with the wreath level in front of her, and she looked at the shrouded wall. "Come on, give us a smile, Grandma front row," Ashcroft called, filming her now on his own phone, holding it up over the rope so the lens was a foot from her face. "You're famous. You're gonna be on the internet." She looked once, briefly, into the little glass eye of the lens, and then away, back to the wall, as if it were not there. As if a phone camera were a very small and very unimportant thing compared to the shrouded granite at the head of the field. There was something in the way she dismissed it that took the fun out of it for a moment, even for Ashcroft, and he lowered the phone and did not quite know why. Then Dunmore said something to him behind his hand, and they both laughed again, and the little cruelty found its feet and kept walking. Then the line shifted, the way a standing crowd shifts, everyone drifting forward 6 inches at once, and Margot drifted with it. Dunmore read it as her creeping toward the front again, and this time he shoved her, a flat hand between the shoulder blades, hard enough that in the jostle, the faded photograph slipped from under the wreath's ribbon and fell. Ashcroft scooped it up off the grass. He glanced at it. A young Marine in a helmet, a boy, grinning at a camera 58 years dead, smirked and handed it back to her upside down. Margot took it. She turned it right side up with 2 fingers and pressed it flat against the wreath, and she did not explain him. The boy in the photograph had been dead 58 years. She had carried his face longer than either of these young men had been alive, and she was not going to hand him to a phone. "You want to be careful," she said, low and even. "Who you put your hands on, son." "That a threat, Grandma?" Dunmore said. "A courtesy." An older couple further up the line saw the shove and winced and looked at each other and said nothing. The machinery of the ceremony was too big and too solemn to interrupt over one pushy sergeant and one stubborn old woman. So the machine rolled on, and the old woman stood in the place they kept shoving her into, and, if you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid, stay with this one. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, because the boy in the pressed uniform is about to find out exactly whose line he has been guarding. It stopped being a joke a minute later. What had gotten into Dunmore was the thing that gets into a certain kind of young man when he cannot make an old person afraid of him. He could not stand it. He decided to solve it with paper. "You got an honored guest lanyard?" he demanded. "Blue lanyard, VIP credential. You got one." She did not. Her name had reached the base too late to be printed on anything. Her record had been sealed for 58 years, and the men who finally unsealed it had gotten her name onto the citation list and no further. The lanyard office had closed for the weekend before the paperwork cleared. She had driven 4 hours and parked in the public lot and walked up to the wall for her men with a wreath and a photograph and no blue lanyard. And to Sergeant Dunmore, that absence was a conviction. "No lanyard, no seat, no business at the front," he said. "That's how this works." "That's how you think it works," Margot said without heat. "There was a time, Sergeant, when the front of the line was for the people who paid for it. Nobody checked lanyards on the reverse slope." "Ma'am, I don't know what that means, and I don't have time for it." He was getting flustered now, and a flustered young man in front of a crowd is a dangerous thing. "You're gonna need to come with security, all right? Nice and easy. Don't make a scene." She almost smiled at that. Don't make a scene. She had once made a scene loud enough that 2 rifle companies of North Vietnamese regulars had spent a whole night convinced the eastern shoulder of a hill was held by 3 times the men who actually held it. She had made a scene with a radio and a flare pistol, and the voices of dead men she kept alive on the net long after they were gone, calling in their names so the enemy would think the line was full. She looked at the boy telling her not to make a scene, and she felt no anger at all, only a great and level tiredness, and something underneath it that might have been pity. Ashcroft pointed at the ribbon on her collar. "You can buy those online, you know," he said, loud for the crowd. "Yeah," Dunmore said. He warmed to it. "Whatever that little ribbon's supposed to be. Lose it. You don't wear that to a Marine ceremony and expect anybody to salute it. Take the costume jewelry off before somebody thinks you're claiming something." He had, without knowing it, just told a Navy Cross recipient to remove her Navy Cross at a memorial to the men she had earned its saving. Margot's hand came up to the ribbon, not to take it off, but to settle it straighter. A small, unbothered gesture, the way you might touch a thing precious to you when a stranger insults it. "I'll leave it where it is, Sergeant," she said. Dunmore keyed the radio clipped at his shoulder and called for a base security escort to walk an unauthorized individual off the front and back to the public lot. The word went out over the net in the flat, bored language of a man reporting a parking problem. Near the command tent, Sergeant Major Van, phone to his ear, heard the wrong name. Unauthorized individual, laid over the right description. Old woman, red blouse, front of the memorial line. And he lowered the phone and started moving faster than a man in dress blues should move on a parade field. Through all of it, the old woman did not move. She stood her ground with the wreath held level and her eyes on the shrouded wall, not defiant exactly, simply immovable, a woman who had been ordered off worse ground than this and had not gone. "I'll lay my wreath, Sergeant," she said. "Then you can walk me anywhere you like." A base security Marine started across the grass toward her from one direction, and from the other, Sergeant Major Van broke into a near run, one hand raised. Van reached them first. He put himself between the security Marine and the old woman and told the escort, without heat, to stand fast. Then he turned on Dunmore, and his voice dropped into the register that senior enlisted men keep for the worst days of a young Marine's life. "Sergeant, take your hands off that idea right now. You do not know who this is. I am not certain I do. But I know that ribbon. And if I am right, you have spent 10 minutes shoving a legend around in front of 200 cameras." Dunmore was too far out in front of the crowd to back down gracefully, and pride carried him past the exit. "With respect, Sergeant Major, she's a walk-up with no lanyard. I'm doing my job." "Your job," Van said, "was never to lay hands on the honored dead zone. Your job was to guard this line, not to decide who is worthy to stand in it. Now stand fast and shut your mouth." "She doesn't have a... I heard you the first time. No lanyard." Van's voice never rose, and that was the frightening thing about it. "You know what else doesn't have a lanyard, Sergeant? The name on that wall. The men we are here to honor did not stop at a table and get a badge on a string before they climbed a hill and died on it. We hung a lanyard on the whole idea of honor this morning, and you decided it was a fence. It is not a fence. It never was." He let that land. "Now, I am going to speak to this Marine, and you are going to learn something today that no schoolhouse was ever going to teach you. And if you are the man, I hope you can still be. You will be grateful for it. By tonight. Stand fast." Dunmore stood fast. Something in the sergeant major's certainty had finally gotten through the pride, and the first cold thread of doubt had begun to work its way into him. He turned to the old woman, and something in the way he held himself changed. Squarer, older, more careful. A man setting down everything he was carrying so that his hands would be free. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "may I ask what your billet was at Khe-San?" "The Eastern Wire." She said it simply, the way you would give a home address. 881 South. Somebody had to hold it. Vaughn keyed his own radio. He did not use her name. He said one word into it, and he said it the way you say a word you have only ever read. Bastion. Then, quieter, to the net. Get the presiding officer. Tell him Bastion is on the field, at the rope, and tell him to hurry. Up at the dais, the tallest of the 3 general officers turned his head, as though someone had spoken directly into his ear. What the boy in the pressed uniform did not know is what the next 4 minutes were about to teach him, and teach a field full of Marines, about the old woman he had been shoving off the grass. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault so you do not miss the moment the whole field turns. To understand the next 4 minutes, you have to go back 58 years, to a hill the maps called 881 South on a freezing night in February of 1968. The fog came up the slopes of the hill in the dark, like something breathing. On the eastern shoulder, dug in among a rifle platoon, was a small detachment nobody at home would ever be told about. A handful of Marines running radios and listening gear the Corps did not officially admit it had put on that hill. Corporal Marguerite Ellison was 20 years old. She sat in a hole scraped out of red mud with a radio handset in her fist, and her back against sandbags gone stiff with cold, and beside her worked her radio man, Lance Corporal Emmett Barlow, 19, of a coal town in West Virginia, so small he said you could spit across it. They had a joke about the call signs. The net name for their position was Bastion, the place that holds, and Barlow thought it was the funniest thing on the hill. You know they only gave us that call sign 'cause nobody believes a hole in the ground can hold, he said, blowing on his fingers. Then we'll be the first hole that does, Ellison said. He was 19, and he missed his mother's cooking, and he had a girl back home named Ruth Ann, whose letters he read out loud to the whole position whether they wanted him to or not. And he had a way of making the worst nights on the worst hill in the worst war of that generation feel, for whole minutes at a time, survivable. He carried a photograph of Ruth Ann inside his helmet band and a rosary his grandmother had given him around his neck, and he told Ellison, more than once, that the 2 of them were going to walk off that hill and he was going to buy her a steak dinner the size of a truck tire the day they got stateside. You don't have to buy me dinner, Barlow. Somebody's gotta. You never eat. You just drink coffee and yell at the radio. He grinned in the dark. Somebody's gotta take care of you, Corporal. You spend all your time taking care of us. She had not answered that. She had just told him to check his batteries. And he had checked his batteries. And neither of them had known that they had fewer hours left together than they had fingers to count them on. The probe came a little after 2 in the morning. It came the way those things always came. A single mortar round, almost polite, and then the world tore open. Green tracer floated up the slope and then stopped floating and started snapping. Mortars walked up the hill in even strides. There were sappers in the wire before anyone had finished understanding that the night had changed. The detachment's lieutenant was hit in the first minute. The section sergeant went down in the third. And the line, which is not a thing of wire and sandbags, but a thing of men deciding they will not run, began to bend. Ellison took the net and the wire at the same time. There was no decision to it, no metal in her head, no thought at all of the woman she would be 58 years later. There was a line, and the line was bending, and she was the one still standing at the hinge of it. So she held the hinge. She called illumination and got it. The flares cracked open overhead and hung the whole hillside in swinging white light. She called fire and walked it in close, closer than the book allowed, close enough to feel it in her teeth. She moved men by name, her voice flat and steady on the net and flatter and steadier off it, and where the line was thinnest, she put herself. She did a thing that night that they would talk about for as long as the detachment existed, which was not long, because the detachment did not officially exist. when the eastern shoulder had lost so many men that the line could not have held against a serious push, she started calling the dead. She keyed the net and spoke to Marines who were already gone, gave them orders, gave them sectors, answered for them in changed voices, filled the air with the sound of a position 3 times as strong as the one she actually had. And somewhere out in the dark, the men trying to take the hill heard a full and confident line where there should have been a broken one, and they hesitated. And hesitation on a hill at 3 in the morning is worth a company of reinforcements. She held the eastern shoulder with a radio and the names of dead men and a refusal, absolute and total, to let go. A mortar round walked into the sandbags beside her. Barlow took the shrapnel, keeping the radio up, turning his body between the blast and the set so that she could keep calling fire, because a radio is worth more than a man on a hill at 2 in the morning, and both of them knew it, and he did it anyway. She reached him. He was already going. She got her hand flat on his chest, and she called one more fire mission with the handset in her other fist, because he would have been furious if she had stopped to hold him and let the net go dark. "Keep it up, Bastion," he said. His voice was very calm. Don't let go of the net." "I've got it, Barlow. I've got it. You rest." "Keep it up." He said the call sign one more time, so quietly she felt it more than heard it. And then he was gone against the sandbags, with her hand on his chest, and the handset still live and warm in her other hand. She kept the net up. She would spend the rest of her life understanding exactly what it had cost her to keep the net up. By first light the wire held. The fog burned off gray, and then gold, and the eastern shoulder of Hill 881 South was still theirs, and the young corporal who had held the hinge of it began to carry men down. She carried and dragged 5 wounded Marines down the reverse slope to the medevac pad, one at a time, on a torn-up ankle she didn't yet know was broken. One of the 5 was the platoon commander of the adjacent rifle platoon, a first lieutenant named Douglas Wistrom, with a chest full of steel, who lived only because a 20-year-old woman would not stop climbing back up the hill for one more man. She went back up a 6th time, at the end, when the birds were already inbound, and she brought Barlow down too. She would not leave him on the hill. She carried the boy who kept the net up down to the pad in her own arms and laid him in the light. And then she sat down in the red mud beside him and did not say anything to anyone for a long time. The corpsman, Fitch, found her there and looked at her ankle, which had swollen the boot tight, and told her it was broken and had been broken for hours, and asked her how in God's name she had carried 5 men down on it. She had not answered him. She had reached into Barlow's helmet band and taken out the photograph of Ruth Ann, and she had put it in her own breast pocket, and she had decided, sitting in the mud with the rotor wash beginning to flatten the elephant grass, that she would carry the boy the rest of the way, not down the hill. She had already done that. The rest of the way, through the years, through her whole life, however long it turned out to be. She would carry him. She had written to Ruth Ann later, and she had gone to see her once in 1971, and the 2 of them had sat in a kitchen in West Virginia and cried over a boy who used to read letters out loud on a hill nobody was allowed to know about. And she had gone on, carrying him, quietly, for 58 years, the way you carry the ones you could not save, which is to say forever, and without complaint, and without ever once setting them down. 58 years later, the same woman stood at the back of a memorial line with that boy's photograph pressed to a white wreath, and a sergeant's hand closed on her elbow to march her away. Because Dunmore, humiliated now, cornered by the sergeant major's warning and unable to make himself believe any of it, doubled down the way a certain kind of man always doubles down. He took Margot by the elbow and pulled. "That's it. We're done. You're walking with me, right now. or I carry you off this field." She let him turn her a quarter step, and then her free hand came up and closed around his wrist. It was not a slap. It was not a twist. It was a grip. His hand stopped as though it had been set in concrete. The tendons stood up on the back of it. The strength ran out of his fingers without his permission, and his hand opened on her elbow and let go because it simply could not do anything else. For 1 second, the whole crowd saw it. The way a still pond will show you the shape of the thing moving underneath it. The operator under the old woman. The hinge that did not bend on Hill 881 South. Then it was gone, folded back under the calm, and only the sergeant's white face was left to say that it had been real. She released him and stepped back into her stillness. "I told you," she said, "to be careful who you put your hands on." The photograph had come loose again in the struggle and landed face up on the grass between them, the boy in the helmet looking straight up at the morning sky. Both of them looked down at it. Dunmore, rattled now, his wrist still ringing, did not understand what he was looking at. Van stepped in close to him, close enough that no camera would catch the words, and said them very quietly. "Sergeant, come to attention. Do not move again, and do not say another word. The presiding officer has left the dais." At the dais, a microphone went live, and a single word came across the whole field in a general officer's voice. "Bastion." Every head on the parade field turned. Lieutenant General Harlan Wistrom was 60 years old and had 3 stars on each shoulder, and he leaned to the microphone and said it again, so that all 300 people in the line and every Marine on the field could hear it clearly. Sergeant Major Marguerite Ellison, call sign Bastion, Eastern Wire, Hill 881 South, February of 1968. He had been raised on her. His father had come home on her back. He had learned to walk in a house where her name was said the way other families say grace, and he had grown up and gone to war himself, and come home and pinned on star after star, and in all those years he had never once been able to find her to thank her, because her file was a wall of black ink, and no one would tell him where she was, or even whether she was living. And there she was, at the back of the line, being shoved off the grass by a sergeant. He stepped down off the dais. He did not stroll. He walked, fast, straight, cutting across the open field toward her in his dress blues with his jaw set. And beside him, after half a heartbeat, Major General Roland Pace, the division commander, 2 stars bright on his shoulders, broke formation and fell into step. Under his breath, low, only to Wistrom, Pace said, "If you're walking, we're walking." And a beat behind them, Brigadier General Sutton Vale stepped out of the official party too, 1 star and 53 years old, and came across the grass at a near jog to catch up. There is an order to a thing like a rededication ceremony. There is a place where the generals stand and a place where they do not, a sequence of who moves and when, a whole architecture of protocol built up over 250 years, precisely, so that no one has to decide anything in the moment. For 3 general officers to step out of that architecture and simply walk, to abandon the dais and the sequence and the careful choreography and cross the open grass on their own 2 feet toward a single old woman at the back of a public line, was a breach of every rule of the morning. And not one Marine on that field would ever, for the rest of his life, describe it as anything but the most correct thing he had ever seen done. Because there is protocol, and then there is the thing protocol was built to serve, and every so often the second one walks out onto the grass and reminds you what the first one was always for. 3 general officers, out of ranks, crossing a parade field on Memorial Day to reach one old woman in a red blouse. They reached her, and Lieutenant General Wistrom stopped 1 pace out and came to attention and saluted her first, a 3-star general holding a salute for a retired sergeant major. Pace and Vale came to attention on either side of him and rendered honors with him, 3 raised hands in a row, and the old woman looked at them with her steady gray eyes and, after a moment, brought her own hand, up in the crisp, economical salute of a body that has never once forgotten how, and returned it. Then Wistrom dropped his salute and took her free hand in both of his. "Ma'am, my father was the lieutenant on the adjacent platoon, Douglas Wistrom. You carried him down that hill with a hole in his chest and a broken ankle of your own. He came home and he married my mother, and he raised 4 children, and every one of us grew up knowing your call sign before we knew the Pledge of Allegiance. I have wanted to say thank you my entire life, and I never knew where you were." For the first time all morning, something moved behind the old woman's stillness. "He was heavier than he looked, your father," she said. "Complained the whole way down. Good man, though. I'm glad he made it home. I'm glad he got you." Sergeant Major Vaughn stepped forward, then with the ceremony's leather citation book open in his hands, and in the ringing silence of the field, he read the Navy Cross citation aloud. He read about the Eastern Wire and the night probe, and the officers who fell, and the corporal who took the line and held it, and the illumination and the danger close fire, and the 5 wounded Marines carried down the reverse slope under fire at first light. And he read the last line the way it was written, and his voice was not entirely steady when he got to it. "And Lance Corporal Emmett Barlow, who fell keeping the net alive, and whom she would not leave upon the hill." Brigadier General Sutton Vale had come up in a corps that did not, for most of her career, quite know what to do with her. She had been the only woman in a great many rooms, and she had learned the way the only woman in the room learns, which is by finding the ones who came before and holding on to their names like handrails in the dark. She had learned the story of the Eastern Wire as a young lieutenant from a master gunnery sergeant who swore it was true and could not tell her the woman's name because the file was sealed. She had carried that nameless story her whole career. The corporal who took the line, who called the dead onto the net, who would not leave her radio man on the hill. And she had told it to younger women in her turn, a legend without a name, a handrail without a face. And now the face was standing 3 feet from her in a red blouse, and Vale found, to her own surprise, that she could not entirely see, and she let the tears come and did not wipe them, and rendered her honors with a wet face, and was not ashamed of it. At the name of Emmett Barlow, the whole field came to its feet and stood. The Gold Star mothers stood. The old men in their unit caps stood. The colonels and the band, and the rows of Marines in the folding chairs stood. And 300 people in the memorial line stood. And the only 2 people not standing were an old woman, who was already on her feet, and a young sergeant who could not make his legs do anything at all. Dunmore's face ran the whole circuit in about 4 seconds. Confusion first, then disbelief, then the slow, horrible arrival of recognition, and then horror, pure and cold, as he understood in his own body exactly whose elbow he had held in his hand, and shoved between the shoulder blades and called costume jewelry. He came to attention alone at the back of the field, white and shaking, and lifted his hand in a salute to an old woman he could not make himself look in the eye. The reckoning found Dunmore fast, the way it does. His company first sergeant reached him within the minute, and behind the first sergeant came his platoon commander, both of them the particular shade of gray that Marine leaders turn when one of their own has embarrassed the Corps in front of 3 generals and a news camera. He was relieved on the spot, pulled off the cordon, his post handed to another Marine, and his first sergeant began, in a low, urgent voice, to promise the generals that this would be handled, that there would be a full accounting, that the sergeant's career would answer for the morning. Lieutenant General Wistrom let it run for a moment. Then he looked at Margot, because it was hers to say and he knew it. He and Margot waved the whole thing off in the same even voice she had used on the rope. "He's a young Marine at his post on a hard morning," she said, "and nobody ever told him whose line he was guarding. Don't break him for it. Take his arrogance. He's got too much of it, and it'll get somebody killed one day if you leave it in him. But leave him his career. Leave him his rank. Let him learn it standing up." She had held a line all night for men she would never meet. She was not going to end a boy's career over a shove. Wistrom inclined his head. "As you say, Sergeant Major." He turned to Dunmore, and he did not raise his voice, and somehow that was worse than if he had. "You heard her, son. She just saved your career standing over the grave of a boy who saved her radio. You will spend the rest of your service trying to be worth that, and you will probably fall short, because most of us do. But you will try. That is the price of what she just did for you. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Dunmore said. "No," Wistrom said, not unkindly. "You don't? Not yet. But you will, if you're lucky, in about 30 years, on some other field, watching some other young Marine shove some other old one out of a line. Then you'll understand it. And I hope to God you do for that one what she just did for you." He let it stand a moment. "Dismissed to the wall, Sergeant. Not the parking lot. The wall. Go read the names. All of them. Start at the top." Then the three generals did the thing the cordon had spent all morning refusing to do. They walked her to the front of the line themselves, Wistrom on her right and Pace on her left, and Vale a pace ahead, clearing the way. They brought the old woman up the length of the roped line to the head of it, to the foot of the shrouded wall, and the covering came off the black granite in the sea wind, and the names stood cut and gold in the morning light. They stood aside, all three of them, and let her go the last few steps alone. She laid the white wreath at the base of the wall. She tucked the faded photograph in among the flowers. The boy in the helmet turned to face the names, and she stood a moment with her head bowed and her hand flat over her heart, over the pale ribbon, and said something too quiet for any microphone to catch. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this old Marine's story find the people who need it. The field emptied slowly through the afternoon, the way a field does after a thing like that. People reluctant to be the first to leave, then all leaving at once. By the time the light had gone long and gold and low off the granite, there was almost no one left. The band had packed its cases. The chairs stood empty in their white rows. The old woman was still at the wall, and beside her, cap in his two hands, stood Sergeant Dunmore. He had come back on his own. No one had ordered him to. He stood a respectful pace behind her until she felt him there, and, without turning, said, "Come here, Sergeant." He came. She ran the pad of her thumb along the cut granite until she found the one name she had come 4 hours and 58 years to touch, Lance Corporal Emmett Barlow, and she took the young sergeant's hand, the same hand that had shoved her, and pressed his open palm flat against the carved letters. "His name is Barlow," she said. "He was 19 years old. He came from a town in West Virginia so small he used to say you could spit across it, and he thought our call sign was the funniest thing on that whole hill. He turned his own body into a shield so I could keep a radio alive, and it killed him. And he spent his last breath telling me not to let go of the net. I have carried him down that hill every single day for 58 years. She held his palm against the stone. "The ribbon you told me to take off this morning, the costume jewelry, it is his. Every man I brought down that slope, it's theirs. I only ever wore it for them. Earn it, Sergeant, before you move the next old woman out of your line, because you will never once know which old woman it is." "Yes, ma'am," Dunmore said. He could barely get the words out. "Yes, ma'am." Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.